This is Stephen Mullens, Instructional Professor of Meteorology here at the Department of Geography at UF. So right now we're talking about tropical storm still Ian, which is now progressing into the western and northwestern parts of the Caribbean. It is now due southwest of Jamaica. This is the National Hurricane Center forecast for Tropical Storm Ian, showing that we are still developing a fairly small circulation storm, but it is expected to strengthen once we get past today and into Monday, where Monday it ought to be a hurricane strength and very rapidly intensifying, so that it's not only just a Category 1 hurricane here, but now it's a Category 3 hurricane by the time this storm reaches Cuba on Tuesday morning. Going from a very weak storm all the way to a major hurricane is explicitly forecasting a rapid rate of intensification that is stronger than the National Hurricane Center has ever forecasted before. So that's a pretty serious thing. This storm should then remain a major hurricane from the time where it enters the Gulf of Mexico and travels into the far eastern Gulf of Mexico and starting to think about Florida and making landfall somewhere in Florida. However, what's important to note is that it's not going to remain a major hurricane, but is expected to dissipate down to a Category 2, at least, hurricane before it makes landfall. Now, this is good because we are thankful that we are not going to have a Category 4 or Category 5. However, a Category 2 storm can still ruin your day for some very important reasons. The other thing that we don't know about this forecast just yet is whether the storm is going to progress down the eastern side of this storm and start thinking about a Tampa or Cedar Key type of landfall and then progressing north through the Gainesville and past Jacksonville area, or whether maybe it'll go down the left side of this forecast and go into the panhandle of Florida. Some of the things that we don't know about this forecast are exactly where the storm is going to be forming during the day today and how aggressive during the day today the storm is going to be intensifying into a hurricane or into a major hurricane. Is that intensification going to get started throughout the day today, or are we going to have to wait for the storm to start intensifying until tomorrow? That timing of when the storm will really start to intensify will then govern how strong the storm is once it enters the Gulf of Mexico, and that will play into whether the storm is going to take this left track or this right track up here. So if we look at the storm right now, this is an animated satellite loop of Tropical Storm Ian. We see the morning and daybreak going by right there, and as we progress into the day-to-day, I'm currently recording this at 11:45 a.m. Eastern Time. It looks like we have the storm spinning right about here, just by eyeing it up on satellite, and we see these really strong storms on the north and east side looking at Jamaica and about to cause a lot of rainfall in that direction. But those storms are pretty separate from the center of Ian itself. If we want the storm to intensify, then we're going to need these showers and thunderstorms that are right around the center to become the strongest part of the storm. And that may be what we see by the time the storm progresses northwest and gets toward Cuba. However, what we are starting to see is that throughout the day today, the storm is continuing to progress westward, but it isn't really strengthening a whole ton yet. These millibars are going from 1,003 to 1,001. That's not a ton, and these yellow dots are specifically the instruments called drop zones that we're dropping down into the eye and into the center of the storm to see how strong the middle of it is. The lower the pressure, the stronger the storm, and these are still up by that 1,000 millibars and up. So the storm isn't starting to strengthen just yet. And that's important because the longer that we wait, the weaker the storm might be by the time that it crosses Cuba and enters the Gulf of Mexico. So there's a chance when we look at this forecast here that we might not quite be at major hurricane status. Maybe we're only at a Category 1 or Category 2 as the storm crosses western Cuba, which again, a Category 1 or 2 storm can be bad for your day, but worse is worse, as they say. Why might the storm remain weak depends on what's going on at the top of the storm. If we look at one of our two world standard models, what we can see going on at the top of the storm is winds that are progressing away from the center of the storm in all directions. Now, this is exactly what you want if you want a very strong storm. If you have air that is going up, then what we need is when it hits the stratosphere, which because of how the atmosphere is organized by temperature, the air can't go into the stratosphere, but it can't build up and build up and build up right there forever. So the air is going to need to escape to all sides. If we see winds escaping from all sides in all directions in the way that we do in this model, then that means that the storm can strengthen. If we can't have the winds going away from it, then we're going to be able to kill our updraft, and it's not going to be as strong, and the storm isn't going to remain as strong or become as strong as quickly. So in this model, these winds going away from the storm in all directions remains true not only from now, which is what this image is showing, but as we progress away from it, and we still see into the future the winds able to progress away from the storm in all directions, and we see these numbers here progressing from 999 millibars down to 983 and 968, starting to become a major hurricane by the time we reach western Cuba. However, if we compare that to the other world standard model, we see that right now, this model has the storm as a little bit weaker, 1,004 millibars as opposed to 999, and those winds are not progressing away in all directions from where the storm is at the surface, but rather it's going away in all directions from this spot a little bit to the east and behind the storm. Well, why is that happening? Well, basically, this model sees all of the thunderstorms and the strongest storms as being behind the storm as opposed to around the storm's center. And if we look back at our satellite picture, that's basically what's happening, in that all of these showers back here are the strongest storms, and that's helping this wind pattern to be where the winds are going away from a single point in a location different from the center of the storm. And this remains true as we progress forward. The area where the winds are going away from are still way back here by Jamaica, as opposed to over top of the storm. And so even though we've advanced, the center pressure down here hasn't been able to go below 1,000 millibars. And that remains true until we get into Monday. So this is about Monday morning, and it looks like we're starting to see once again the winds able to progress away from the storm in all directions, and finally we've crossed below 1,000 millibars, and when we get up to Cuba we're about 986 millibars, and that is compared to the other model that we were just looking at, which was able to develop the storm a lot quicker, and now we had 968 millibars as opposed to 986. So this is still a hurricane strength storm, but in the other model this is a major hurricane strength storm, and the only difference is that we didn't have as strong a thunderstorms over the storm today, and so we had to wait until tomorrow until we could have the thunderstorms be able to create this pattern of winds going away from the surface, which helped the updraft become stronger. So it's just a waiting game in this model. The reason that becomes important is when we start to look at our options downstream when the storm gets past Cuba. So right now the question is going to be, where is our low-level center going to form? All of those black dots there are going to be our options. When we progress forward in time, we see that there are forecasts where the storm is just off the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula, or as far east as over the western Cuba there, and just south of Key West. So this is kind of the alley where the storm is going to progress, which is what lines up with our official forecast from the National Hurricane Center. The good news about this current forecast is that when we compare to some of the options from a couple of days ago, we didn't know where the storm was going to end up, if it was going to end up almost at the border of Belize, or if it was going to go through central Cuba and progress even east of Miami. But because of where this storm has formed, we were basically at first able to take out the right side of these options, and then today we were able to basically take out the lefternmost side of these options. So we have a better answer as to where the storm is going to wind up once it gets to Cuba. However, when we start looking at the model that was able to strengthen Ian faster once it got to Cuba and entered into the Gulf of Mexico, now the storm is able to deepen Ian to become even a potentially very, very strong Category 4 or higher storm in the Gulf of Mexico, which is pretty scary. It also has more options for the storm going into the Panhandle. There are still a couple of options for the storm to progress into the Tampa area and farther east, but most of the members are taking the western option and going into the Panhandle. The nice thing about this forecast is that even though the storm is very strong in the Gulf and potentially looking very scary on satellite, when you start tracking these individual dots, what you'll see is that these purples, as they progress north, start turning into the dark reds and light reds again, and even into the oranges prior to landfall. So when I progress all these dots past here and look at the colored lines, all of the purples are remaining offshore, and we see a weakening trend in the model as they progress into landfall. So this is good in that, like I said before, a stronger storm is generally going to be a worse time for you. But again, a Category 2 can still be bad for your day. The exception to this is the options that takes the storm to the northeast. This is still going to be a storm that maybe didn't get to a Category 4 at all, but it may also make landfall as a Category 2 or Category 3 storm. So that's not that great. The other story is when we look at that other model where the storm did not intensify until right before it got into Cuba. So it's entering the Gulf of Mexico in a weaker state, but it basically stays that intensity up through landfall, and also more of the options in this model feature a storm that progresses into the central panhandle and maybe into the northern panhandle. Once again, we're not really showing as much of a weakening trend prior to landfall. So one way or another, whether it gets really strong before it reaches Cuba or not, if it progresses northeast into the Tampa-ish and central Florida panhandle area, we're probably going to see something like a Category 2 or Category 3 storm here. If, on the other hand, the storm strengthens quite a bit, it might get very strong in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, but if it heads toward the Panhandle, it's probably going to weaken before landfall. The reason it's going to weaken before landfall is that if we look at the jet stream, here is Ian still in Northwest Gulf. Now it progresses past Cuba and into the eastern Gulf of Mexico, heading toward the Panhandle. And what we see are a very strong jet stream going up from Alabama through Georgia and into Virginia. But these winds, even though a little bit weaker, start back in southern Texas. So as Ian progresses into this area, you have winds at a very high altitude, progressing across the top of the storm, basically knocking it over. The strongest hurricanes are oriented straight up all the way from the surface to the top of the troposphere. Well, if you have winds that are knocking over the top of this storm, then you have a storm that is vertical for a while and then starts to tilt over, and that caps the top of the storm and therefore weakens it. And so here we see once again tracking the millibars in this particular run, a 946 is a major hurricane probably, but then we start to progress to the 952, 956, 61, 63, 71, and 980 at the time of landfall. Still a hurricane, but not quite the major hurricane that it was. So that shows the possibility of that weakening trend. The other thing that helps is when we start looking at the moisture field. So this is the green areas showing very strong humidity, and also the locations where it's probably going to be raining ahead of Ian. So here Ian is progressing past western Cuba, but by this time it is already starting to rain in southern and central Florida. In fact, it starts to rain in the Miami area starting Monday morning. This rain then progresses past the central and into northern Florida by the time we get through Tuesday and into Wednesday morning, and we're getting rain well ahead of the storm. But what's also happening as far as the storm is concerned is all of this dry air is progressing south out of Texas and Louisiana into the western Gulf, and is starting to wrap its way into Ian and starting to get into the center of the storm. So just as those winds at the top of the storm are tearing it apart, you also have the dry air making its way into the center of the circulation, which makes for an ugly looking storm indeed by the time it makes landfall. So it could actually be that the rain ends just as the center of the storm is finally making landfall into the peninsula here. This is probably in some ways the best case scenario, because even though all of these places in the panhandle are getting 2 days of rain, for those areas in the panhandle that would be seeing direct landfall, you have to deal with the rain ahead still, but maybe the wind isn't going to be quite as strong, and the surge isn't going to be quite as strong, and the storm can be over relatively quickly as compared to if this was still a major hurricane with rain wrapping all the way around the south side of the storm, and you have to still deal with rain through the rest of Friday after the storm passes through. In the other option where we have the storm progressing into the Tampa area, we still have a similar story where the rain is entering the southern peninsula south of Lake Okeechobee by Monday evening and into Tuesday, well ahead of the storm. But once again, we have this dry air making its way around the south side and into the east side of the storm, making it a fairly windy affair. But once again, once the middle of the storm makes its way to you, the rain may very well end. Unfortunately, in this particular run, the storm starts to kind of crawl over this area, so we may be dealing with a very strong winds for a lot longer. We would hope for a faster storm here, but maybe the rainfall, maybe this will help to minimize rainfall just a little bit, and maybe we can pray for this storm to be a little bit faster like the other options. As always, if we have these two world-class models that are disagreeing here, the preference and the expert guidance is to take the average of these two storms. So if this is 18Z Thursday in the one model, and we back this up to be at the same time, then here to line up the models, we have low pressure here. Let's line up the image. We have this low pressure here. So if the guidance is to take the middle of these two runs, then we're probably going to have a decently strong storm just off the coast of Tampa here. And then as we progress from 18Z into 6Z Friday, we have this storm progressing its way just a little bit. And then we have this storm progressing its way north as well. And then we can see the differences in not just intensity, but in the rainfall locations between these two. So we're probably going to get something that is in between these two looks. Going back to considering all of the possibilities. What we see is the official forecast is here in the black dots, and then we have the highlighted yellow areas showing the likelihood of perhaps this eastward track that I talked about, where the storm is off the coast of Tampa and heading up into northern Florida, the northern peninsula here, and east of the Panhandle. So that's probably going to be somewhere that's fairly likely. So this is, once again, the National Hurricane Center forecast. We're going to prepare for the worst, which means preparing for this major hurricane possibility as the storm is crossing Cuba. These red colors here indicate hurricane warnings, and then we have tropical storm warnings east of that. Noting by the time it gets to here, the storm could be a quite sizable storm, with most of it being on the eastern side of the center here. So if that is true, progressing up into the eastern Gulf of Mexico, then once again, we should probably prepare for tropical storm force winds out into the southern part of the Florida Peninsula and wrapping around the storm there. So the entire peninsula here should prepare for a lot of rain, a decent amount of wind from equivalent of a Category 2 and maybe even Category 3 storm, even if it is weakening down from a major hurricane status here. Once we get to this Monday and Tuesday morning, we'll have a lot better answers as far as exactly where landfall is going to be in Florida and exactly who is going to get the most amount of rainfall. So that will be when we have better updates as a science. That's it for now. Thanks for watching.